Hello. Yes, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I want to welcome you to yet again another viable say. This one is for Mr. Peter Ssimbwa. Those of you who are in the morning, we had one which ended around the late around the 1. So, Mr. Ssimbwa, you're most welcome to your day. And the chairperson of the session today is none other than the Dean of School of Social Sciences, where Mr. Peter belongs, School of Education. I'm sorry, the School of Education, Dr. Esther Namugumia, you're most welcome. And I want to inform members again, of course, this is the public defense. We expect people in here and those who are following us online. Our candidates at Nkumba University are assessed at 3 levels. We have an internal examination, and we also have an external examination, external examiner and internal examiner, and the internal scores, the external scores, and then the student is also subjected to a variable say to defend his work. There's also another assessment, and this is where we are on now. This is third assessment. So the student will have gone through 3 assessments, and later on shall collect and get the average. So you're most welcome to this. And the other guidelines I wanted to go through to remind people that we always have a viva that is constituted. And as I said, the viva is chaired by a dean of the school where the student comes from. And the composition is like this. We have the dean, as he tells us, the internal examiner, the external examiner, 2 supervisors, and 2 senior staff members. The chair will go through and we know them, and any other member that may want to attend, because it's a public defense. So without taking more time, I'll ask Dr. Namugumia to, before I hand over to Doctor, I'll ask Nori to pray for us.
God, Heavenly Father, we pray that this student that is going to be assessed presents well and he passes. Amen.
That's a political prayer. I hand over to the chair of the session, Dr. Welcome.
I welcome you members, physically and online, and I thank you for being with us. I wish to constitute this PhD Bible in accordance with chapter 23 and 10 of the postgraduate program of the University Rules and Regulations. I hereby constitute the PhD Viva to Peter Ssimbwa, held on Monday, 31st May 2021 at Nkumba University. The panel that is going to assess Mr. Ssimbwa, I'm Dr. Esther Namugumia, the chairperson. We have Dr. Frank Chiyinji, who is the senior staff, Dr. Kasuja Paul, senior staff, Dr. Simon Peter Ongodia, internal examiner, Dr. Badru Musi, external examiner, Professor Michael Moore, supervisor, and Associate Professor Asimwe Mucho Solomon, supervisor. I welcome you members. The role of the chairperson on this is majorly chairing the Viva workshop listening to the presentation by the candidate, raising questions about the work presented, contributing to the guidance of the candidate, scoring the candidate's performance at the viva shape, and collecting the marks, and informing candidates about the results or status of the presentation. The work of the senior staff member on this panel is listening to the presentation by the candidate, raising questions about the work or presentation, contributing to the guidance of the candidate, and scoring the candidate's performance. Then the work of the internal examiner is listening to the presentation by the candidate, raising questions about the work, contributing to the guidance of the candidate, and scoring the candidate's performance. And then the external listens to the presentation, raises the questions, contributes to the guidance of the candidate, and scores. Then the supervisors, they listen to the presentation, raise questions, and contribute to the guidance of the candidate. Those are the roles of the panelists. And I hope that the team will be supportive enough and will do the needful in this assessment exercise. I now ask the candidate to move out briefly, and then you'll be called back to start your presentation. Mr. Ssimbwa, please. And your audience. Audience online and physical, please, some minutes. We have the procedures.
refugees in Uganda date back to 1926 when Uganda registered one of the biggest numbers of refugees, and 1951. However, by 2015, refugee discourse had been taken by the wave of movement of refugees across the world. And the rest of the countries, poor and rich, had been taken unaware by the increase of refugees globally. And when we look at refugee education service management, is looked at one of the tools or a component of UNHCR interventions in the transformation of transitioning people. So choosing this education was to look at how education has made Uganda one of the proud countries in delivering to improvement of or transformation of lives of the people. Education service management itself is deemed to transform lives of people, creating value in them and enabling them live a life that gives them hope. However, we realize that the Office of the Prime Minister reiterated much on the challenges in the provision of social services, including education. That's why how the management of refugee education in Uganda has been able to deliver quality that is desired in providing durable solutions to the challenges that affect the refugees. So the concept of education and sustainability has become one of the issues. And by 2018, the Comprehensive Refugee Framework for Uganda was looking at education parameters and putting much focus on excellency in performance in regard to delivery of education, equity in education, and how these interventions were delivering to improvement of livelihoods of refugees. So in Uganda, where we receive refugees every year, because Uganda is centrally located in a conflict-blighted zone, it was important that we look at how by 2015 and 2017, this increase in numbers, which have been recorded by most of authors on refugee issues, had been managed by the implementing organizations as well as mandated agencies, so that these people affected are living within what the global appeal 2014-2015 was focusing on in regard to improvement of lives of these people. So looking at quality education in Uganda, we realized that quality, as far as Uganda was concerned, was basically focusing on access and equity. However, when I looked at the issue of quality, I realized that something is missed out when we rate what we call quality of education. And specifically with the refugees, education was not handled in a manner that it brings out the concept of durability in solutions. But most of the intervention were focusing on simplistic, remedies, which do not transform in sustainability and durability. That's why I came out to look at quality in a new perspective, transcending just access and equity, to looking at the inputs, the processes, and the output at the end. So in this perspective, quality is not just an end, but it looks at the processes, the inputs, and also the output. So we cannot see quality at the end when it is not stressed in the processes. And these processes bring into focus the management aspect of it. Also, So in looking at quality, we realize that the theoretical components, the theoretical perspectives here that are informing my study look at how do we get the quality of education manifested in the people. That's why I based on the human capital development theory, the complexity theory, complexity science theory, and the pragmatic theory to look at how really education has been practically handled by education providers in ensuring that the implementation of interventions delivers what really we can be proud of as quality, looking at the capabilities built, looking at the competencies that we get at the end of the day, and also looking at which level are we really providing what we call the education for these people. So in the complexity science theory, I looked at the whole aspect of education through the time when someone starts school to the time when someone graduates out of school. In looking at the complexity theory, it discards the practice of reducing education into components or levels, but look at the holistic view of education in the aspects that you look at when you start the child to when he goes through the school cycle to the time when he graduates out of school, and what this child or this student or this graduate can be able to do with themselves. So historically, we can see that education is traced back from pre-modern to modern times and post-modern time. And it has this history being localized and being put to modern economics, where we globally look at how the education provided creates somebody we regard as a global citizen. So when you look at the history here, it takes us back from the time of 1926 when refugees started coming to Uganda, through 1951 when we had the refugee convention that started looking at how countries would work on ensuring that the displaced people get some level of access to education as a right, and also looking at the Convention of UN 1979, which looked at eliminating all forms of discrimination on displaced people and guaranteeing against all forms of discrimination, especially against women. And also looking at the Convention on Rights of the Children of 1989, which reaffirmed the right of children to be compulsory education. But when it came to secondary education, they regarded as a right to any available form of education. And when we moved to higher education or tertiary education, there was no much emphasis that was put. So serious emphasis was put for children, but disregarding secondary and tertiary education, where we see much productivity of the humans that we create out of our education. So when we look at facts in Uganda, show that refugees in Uganda tremendously increased between 2010 and 2015. And also by 2018, the figures were threatening. So these figures we see in Uganda translate into pressure on educational resources. It translates into pressure on quality assurance in our schools, and also look at the facts and the UNICEF 2014, there were much neglected concerns, majorly two, that is education materials and opportunities. And to this study, opportunities also are brought into the parameters of assessing the quality level of our education. Because if we talk about education being quality, high quality level education, but when opportunities are accessed are very slim to a certain section of society, then that education does not give us much value, which is a measure of quality. And when you look at development assistance for refugees, it requires that these refugee students or children are equipped with the skills to own their development. So in understanding how the management of education is done in line with ensuring that the education they get builds people who are going to be productive, it underpins the context of looking at quality in this study vis-a-vis management. And the facts also show that 74% of refugees were women by 2015, according to UNHCR in 2015. These people who came were women, 74%, and their level of income was very low. And when you look at the figures in the refugee communities, you find that these communities are predominantly having women-headed families. So these people who have poor incomes, in a system where everybody has to pay for their education, are affected by other issues which are worsened by low level of income or no income. So it picks how the education providers and other stakeholders are trying to manage to ensure that these people can access the quality of education. So the problem statement. The problem here that inspired my study was looking at the 2018 supplementary of Office of the Prime Minister, indicated that there was serious reduction in the financial resources and the technical resources going into social services, which was crippling service provision. Therefore, looking at how the complex roles of management of education are done in a situation where resources are so meager was fundamental. And they went ahead to look at other authors where we look at efficiency ratios, infrastructure and resource allocation decisions affecting education. They were marred with the delays, they were raised, as well as bureaucratic systems, which created of systems for students who are coming to Uganda. Also uncertainty in the policy and the framework for the implementers, thus affecting the long-term learning outcomes. This is why DAF 2010, World Bank 2007, and the International Education Network for Interagency Network for Education was looking at these issues as very serious, requiring management interventions that can correct this. And according to the Interagency Network on Education, these issues were basically worsening from the management point of view. That's why we look at this as an issue to investigate. In this diagram here, I look at the issues that are being brought into focus regarding the factors affecting quality of education and the education service management. At the center, we have quality, which is dependent on the level of stakeholders actually come either at policy, and also the legal implications of refugee education have been brought into focus because some issues arise from there, which trickle down into affecting the output, also the processes and the inputs. Education processes and systems also matter when it comes to education quality. So these will be analyzed as we move on. The purpose of this study, before we go to the purpose, I will put here the scope. I try to minimize the number of slides, so I will look at the scope at this point. This study was carried out in Uganda, which is an East African country, one of the top 3 countries that have Africa's refugee population. And it was carried out in 2 districts, 2 of the 12 districts of Uganda, which are hosting refugees. That is the Kiryandongo district and the Kampala districts. In Kampala, the focus was in the central division, that is the Kisenyi 2 parish, where we have a full village that has been taken over by a refugee community. And in Kiryandongo, it was a Boyare refugee settlement. And in the book, I've given more details as regards the geographical location of Uganda and the study areas, which were selected as cases. In these areas also, the scope went on to look at specifically the refugee children in the schools at the time of the study, and the education mandated agencies and implementing partners in those districts or communities that were selected. The purpose here was to explore how refugee education activities, the best practices that have been used in respect to attaining the objectives of education, as well as the implementation of education interventions that have yielded the best results out of the interventions that are set out in the comprehensive refugee framework, also as regards universal primary and secondary education in the mainstream education system of Uganda. So the study sought to understand the variations in the provision strategies that have been implemented or designed for attainment of objectives of education in Uganda. Objectives of the study. The study first objective was to examine the level and the patterns of access to quality education provided in refugee communities, to examine the planning and coordination factors influencing the quality of education for refugee children in Uganda refugee communities, and to assess the effectiveness of refugee education interventions in building skills for self-reliance among the end. The study was expected to quality of education provided in refugee communities. The study was informed by or guided by research questions, and there are 4 research questions said: what factors influence the level of access to adequate education? Adequate education here is used to refer to the quality expectations and standards of the society where those children take an education. What quality management factors influence quality of education provision in the Ugandan refugee communities, and to what extent has implementation of refugee education interventions in Uganda been effective in enhancement of self-reliance of refugee students? The study was informed by literature from prominent scholars and on the subject of refugees, including Marshall in 1996, including the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. And Sarah has written a lot of work on refugee issues, challenges. But here, education providers have gone ahead to deal with the education challenges. So the inconsistencies in teaching, teacher quality, and infrastructure constraints have been written about much. And many reports, including UNESCO 2014, have talked about how these inconsistencies affect quality of education. But the focus here is not these challenges, but how the education managers have gone ahead to create an environment where they deal with the challenges and deliver quality of education. So the gaps here were looked at for research. The gaps for this research identified were the issues in emergency interventions regarding protection of children. We see a lot of girls continue to marry at an early age, young age, despite a long period of sensitization and awareness on mechanisms of reducing marriages among the children, but it continued. So also we looked at interventions which were basically looking at trauma healing and psychosocial interventions. But when we look at development assistance, these ones cannot be good enough if our education managers continue giving these prescriptions for trauma and psychosocial healing, much as these are very critical. And gaps were also identified in how issues have been handled to meet refugee expectations, and what does the refugee have as a perspective for a quality education, apart from the national design of what should be a quality education. Also, gaps were seen, according to Robert, that the educational quality must be shifted from merely looking at equity to cover issues of recognizing and marketing the different educational needs. That is in rural areas, among national or indigenous communities, and also looking at what happens between urban and rural areas. So understanding the roles and responsibility of actors and their effect on delivery of a quality and continuous enjoyment of school was very critical. So the conceptual framework. In the conceptualization of this study, I looked at service management. On and off, I don't know. So in the conceptualization of this study, I looked at education service management as the independent variable. I will appreciate to mention that all through this time, I've been looking at how to improve this work. And probably there would be a variation between this conceptual framework and the one which is in the book. Because of the time reading through, I've made modifications. So education service management has indicators as an independent variable, looking at indicators for service management, education service management as good education plans, alignment of strategies to national objectives, also effective decision-making by the education managers or providers, efficient allocation of resources. And in the other extreme, we have the dependent variable, which is quality of education, determined by indicators ranging from usable knowledge, not just knowledge, but what knowledge do we get and what do we make of that knowledge? And then the relevance of the content and which productive skills do we get from the education and what do we use with those skills after school. Also, we have moderating variables. These ones are policies and legal instruments pertaining at the time. These influence what managers will do, and also they influence the quality given to education. So the instruments, the policies themselves can be inbuilt with the quality component from the start. But if the policies we have do not take keen consideration of quality from the design, then the education managers cannot build much out of it. And I bring into mediating variables between the independent variable and the dependent variable, which are psychological intentions, for example, of the performance. That is, for example, they are designing the management plans are very critical when we look at what will happen at the end. And also, these psychological intentions affect, for example, the learner. Some of the learners will come with no intent to own their education, or some of the refugees entirely don't think there is a value for education. If they have this kind of mindset, how are we going to hold the managers deliver this quality when the recipients are not holding the kind of view that we expect? Structures of institutions are very important when it comes to the implementation or even the founding the governance systems that we want to operate the education that we are putting in place. Also, the education needs are very important. When we are designing, the managers are designing, they have to look at the education needs. This is what guides them. And if the education needs are there, tuned to quality, then it would probably guarantee quality. So we move on to the methodology. This is how I went on to handle the study. All right. I started with developing the study framework, developed the measurement tools and the parameters, worked with the experts in validating whatever and the cases. Data was collected and analyzed at the end. So in this study, the framework that I adopted was at multi level. I had individual level investigations and institutional level investigations. And at individual level, I looked at students, capturing individual opinions of students and also perceptions. While at institutional level, there were heads of schools, heads of mandated refugee agencies, and local governments. That's at institutional level. And in dealing with them, I was guided by certain questions to investigate on access factors and the quality management factors influencing education provision, as well as implementation. The study population in here was based on the reconnaissance that I did at the time of the study. I found out that in the Kampala and the Kiriandongo area that I selected, by the time of the study, the settlement had between 3,000 and 5,000 students. So basing on this, I selected a targeted group of targeted population of 300 students, which I selected using a Krisha and Morgan table of sample determination. And it is from these 310 students that are drawn on as accessible students that I calculated, or following the table, I drawn 169 students as the sample that was supposed to be involved in this study. And in selecting the cases, I used the random selection, but at some point, the purpose that I wanted to make a comparison of provision of education between urban and rural, I took on Kampala district to represent the urban refugees, and then Kiriandongo to represent the rural refugee communities of Uganda. And the sampling methods used here were random sampling and purposive sampling. The data collection was done using both qualitative methods and quantitative methods. And the same methods were used in the analysis of the data. Data was analyzed using qualitative and quantitative methods. So in the data collection, the instruments were designed and head teachers focus, and specifically these were school and those who are attending a program for refugees, which were determined at the time of conducting the study. Key informant interviews were done with the heads of institutions, that is managers of implementing agencies and the schools, teachers and local administrators, including the district education officers. Photography was done, and the observation was also used as a part of the methodology in data collection. So the field strategy is summarized here in the table, looking at how many people were in the answered the questionnaires. That were 54, and 19 key informant interviews were done, as well as 71 people were involved in the focus group discussions. I tried as much as possible to ensure that this study comes up with the reliable, valid, and the generalizable data. The reliability of data and the validity depended on triangulation of methods, respondents, tools, and pre-testing, which were by use of experts at the time of collection of data. So generalizability here was assured with all respondents here being actors in the education and in the education institutions, and those who are providing education in the refugee communities. And the unit of analysis were all students at the time of carrying out this study in the refugee community, as well as those members of the community who were confirmed to be school leavers and who were still living in those communities. And also the response rate high, over 95 samples that were selected, at least 144 respondents stand up and they filled the questionnaires, giving us valid and trustable. This was done qualitatively and quantitatively, as I said. Data was processed for analysis out of the objectives, and the objectives created several themes under which the different data that was gathered was coded, analyzed, and then put into context of the respective themes. Coded data was analyzed using the computer software, Startup 14, and the Vivo 12. And here they said that I was assisted by an IT, a thorough analysis, which can be trusted that were disaggregated in the respective components of age, education level, dynamics in education, and the variations regarding urban and rural areas. And in chapter 4, we look at the historical and philosophical underpinnings. This study was informed by the work of idealists and the existentialist philosophers, as well as pragmatists. We realized that according to John Dewey's inquiry focuses on the world view of education. And this is one of the philosophies that I based on primarily on looking at how the education component has been handled, and how education as a tool has enabled the interaction of these learners in the societies where they live, and the universality that has been involved in this education for refugees as such, looking at how the school leavers are expected to apply the competencies in living. Generalization here, which is seen in the intrinsic theory, according to John, was discarded by Raoul 1971. We see, like in the refugee setting, they get their education in the mainstream education that all children in Uganda have to take that. But in this study, we discard the mentality that we have to generalize these students, because refugees themselves, much as they are taking the education in the mainstream system, they have unique issues and challenges which put them in a special position that needs to be regarded by education managers. So differentiators among students are supposed to be given levels of the different levels must look at the aims of education at different levels and how the goals are met. So philosophers like Henry David Thoreau and Walter Emerson look at universality of education, which is really aligning well with Uganda's policy on universal education for all children in Uganda. However, the view of justice and truth must be considered seriously. We have seen many of these children missing out on education because of cost, missing out because of cultural issues, and missing out because these refugees are poorer, means that there is really a big question on fairness and equity, which are regarded as quality issues. Results. The results are classified according to the 3 objectives and then the policy recommendations. Objective 1 looks at the level and patterns of access to quality understanding of education by the refugee children or the communities where they stay. And level of access and the patterns looks at the access to public and private schools, access according to age, and access to opportunities that are created by provision of secondary school and primary school, how much academic opportunities they get, and how much practical opportunities are available for the children. We see that 10.8% of rural children get opportunities, academic opportunities, compared to 23.1% in urban areas. And refugee access to education by gender and equity in the refugee communities was also put into focus. And we saw that there is really a huge challenge. A lot of girls have gone to school, but their completion rate remains very low. And we also looked at this, that at early age, like in primary school, a lot of these girls exist, but in secondary schools, they have tended to miss out. And we also looked at access to specific scholastic materials given by development organizations, as well as opportunities that are there in regard to quality by way of determining the level of entry and the choice of the school where these children go to. So the measures of access and patterns were portrayed in this table, but we use the descriptive statistics here using the percentages and means to show how much the different variables can be measured in respect to access and the patterns of the children. So I want to mention here that each child who participated in this study was taken to be representing these parameters according to household level, looking at the number of children in the household that are at school, looking at the number of children who are not going to school, and looking at the members of the family who have attended either primary school level, who have attended secondary school, and those who have completed either senior 6 or senior 4. This was used to give us good averages or percentages that could do, that assisted us to make conclusions during the analysis. And in access level, we see that pupils between 6 and 14 years out of school was used as the out of school rate was used as a measure of whether people are accessing the school or they are out of the school, or at which age they drop out of school, at which age they stay in school. So we realized that at different age levels, most of the 6 to 14 years out of school, that level was very small. But at 15 to 18, we had many of these out of school. So this was helping us to look at the access to opportunities for school. So we found out that there were more people or youth who were out of school than the children. And out of the school meant that these people in rural areas and urban areas were missing out on secondary education as well as tertiary education compared to the little ones between age 6 and age 14. And we identified that the major factor here was the cost implication of education and opportunities are available for them to access education at that level. Also, we identified factors that are associated to these access indicators. Age of the children, some of them when they get also non-academic trainings that are being a problem, and the barrier of language as well as curricular change, plus attitude. At a certain level, they develop an attitude which is not good. So here we look at the general issues affecting quality of education as language, accountability, and proper supervision. For example, we found out that in Kiriandongo, the communities were responsible on tracking whether the children are going to school, whether the teachers are there, whether the resources are provided. And this increases opportunities of children to stay in school, or parents being held responsible to send their children to access the kind of education that is available, funding of education, and then cultural diversity. For example, you will find that in the refugee community, you find there are a lot of nationalities, and each nationality has its culture, and each culture has a value attachment to education, which varies from ethnic group to another ethnic group. Where others want to marry their children at an early age, they are a group which prefers to continue sending their children to school, and this caused a variation. And looked at the policies of the district, like Kiriandongo was very strict on ensuring that all children are given an opportunity. Even those that dropped out were encouraged through the district policy to ensure that any child, irrespective of the age, they will be in school, especially the back to school, stay in school policy in the district, which was unique. And in Kampala, it was tried, but it was not much grounded as it was identified in Kiriandongo. So planning and coordination factors affecting education was objective 2. And we looked at quality affected by planning factors, which were rated under processes that create an environment where a child will stay in school or will be attracted in school, or even how they do their responsibilities in terms of instruction, for example, for the teachers, in terms of designing how the systems will work and how they receive the children from other countries. So we realized that Uganda gives a decent reception, but how much does this decent reception continue to manifest also in the practices at schools was analyzed. And what we identified was that the education managers have a big role to play after the policies have been set. Supervision and coordination was very critical. Whatever was supervised, it ended up giving good indicators in terms of completion of school. Curricular issues and assessment of learners were also looked at management level, and we identified issues in here. However, the management of the district and the education implementers were very serious in ensuring that the communities, the children, the parents, and the education providers work together in ensuring that they coordinate properly at all levels. And here I pointed out some of the indicators that were used to map whether the planning and coordination factors are promoting quality education or they are not, including being cognizant of student needs at the school level or at the planning level, and the teachers being helpful to the children, as well as fairness in the treatment of children in the schools where they go to. So we identified that there were issues, but on the average, you find that it is basically on teacher support for children was identified, but in urban areas, teachers were not much working with the students compared to rural areas, and the children in the urban areas were more independent and moved out to look at what they can do on their own, unlike their rural counterparts. And in urban areas like Kampala, we found out that reports were showing a lot of children who are paying their own school fees because they have small jobs they can do. So we looked at this as an empowerment to these students to be able to do it themselves. They can pay for their education, and this is a good indicator of education for self-reliance as far as Uganda is concerned. And in objective 3, I looked at effectiveness, and this was measured or assessed according to the programs that are being implemented for refugees, that is from early childhood development through to tertiary education, vocational educational programs. This was all looked at in order to see where and how much are opportunities provided or created for these refugee children and communities to benefit and obtain their education expectations. So we realized that a lot of programs exist, and a lot of children have gone through early childhood development, and the facilities were good. And this gives such a child enjoyment of school, much as we don't expect much skills here, but the personal growth and development skill in the adult begins at that early level of child growth. So this was very important. And the post-secondary and technical vocational training programs in Kirandongo exist. These had provided opportunity for those who dropped out to have an alternative. And the issue here, which is a management issue, is that we identified that those who go for vocational training at the time of completion, they find themselves not usable in the community if they are not facilitated with the startup kits, or if the institutions themselves are devoid of facilities that equip them with the practical skills. In the implementation of self-reliance strategy, commitment, and the emerging issues, we identified planning, implementation, and monitoring of education as very critical. We identified that in the Kirandongo community, the host community and the refugee community work together properly, which is not the case in Kampala. We also identified that a lot of children in the rural settlement, some refugee children, were missing out as their counterparts, the national students, go to such schools like Madarasatis, are run informally and in closed or unofficial centers, which is a challenge. And this is a policy issue or a management issue which has to be looked at. And participatory planning was seen much in the Kiranongo to be useful, and they used the AGDM, the age where the children, the refugees themselves, the implementing agencies, and the mandated officer and local government meet together to decide, plan, implement, monitor, and even evaluate. So they have assessment meetings which are carried from the age gender approach, where different ethnic groups are represented. And in these meetings, they agree on what they want to be implemented in a given academic year, which is a good practice that was not seen in the schools that was identified in Kampala. So this is a good approach which has yielded a lot of benefit. And efficiency ratios were seen to be really high when it comes to infrastructure. And these points are still a huge challenge in the pupil ratio, the pupil classroom ratio, and then the desk pupil ratio. All these were still very high. Like one desk seats 6 pupils. This is a big number, and it puts a pressure on the learning challenge. The teacher-pupil ratio was also still very high. In the secondary school, we identified one teacher is attending to 108 children. This is a very serious challenge to the teacher and to the learner. Some of the students, at the end of the day, they don't get an evaluation from the teacher. And the contribution to knowledge here is the next chapter or section that we're looking at, which comes under conclusions and contribution to knowledge. So the field view of practitioners in the areas that were studied tells us that the refugees are still unique, culturally and ethnically. Even their socio-economic differentiators, which must be taken serious, but in the planning of education in the mainstream system, the refugees have to learn to compete favorably with others. And we also realize that universalism and absolutism is the way to go. That government control of education is okay. It is proper because it has the, like Socrates talks about the state strategies, state policies, but in the process, there should be initiative of ensuring cooperation of all stakeholders in the management and delivery of education. And this is what the Comprehensive Refugee Framework for 2018 is emphasizing, that all stakeholders must be brought on board. And quality is not supposed to be free. That is what we identify, that every stakeholder must pay a price to ensure that they get the kind of desire is underscored, for example, in the total quality management principles of Dr. Demir. But we also need to realize that continuous improvement is supposed to be always an overriding factor in the collective responsibility to play, closing the gaps in the corruption, mismanagement, and inefficiencies that have manifested in Uganda's education system since 1996, when universal free education was granted. And according to the findings, procedures must be set and guidelines must be there for the processes if managed to the beneficiaries in accordance to the Global Compact on Refugees, where age, gender diversity mainstreaming in institutional and community level is emphasized. Refugee education model here has been advanced. I advanced the refugee education participatory model as part of the contribution, looking at the theory, the models that have been working since 2001 by UNESCO. William advanced school quality model, which looks at the environment of the school. And then UNESCO in 2004 model of policy framework improvement. And models were studied, and basing on them, they all focus on participation. They all focus on creating an environment. But as per this study, I modified the contributions and the analysis that were made on these models to look at not only the institutions that are important. In the refugee framework of 2019, they look at the refugee coordination model basing on the institutions that are doing education. But these institutions have to work hand in hand with the communities or the people they serve. So where are the communities? Where are the children? Where are the different institutions, either private or government, governmental or non-governmental, international or community-based? These all have to work together. It is basing on this that I look at a reform in the model of application of education interventions, where we look at systems created. We should have a very thorough information system, a very thorough accountability system, a very thorough performance management system. At the end of this, we find that we provide enough information, we are accountable to each other at all levels, and then at the end of the day, the performance management systems will help us to evaluate and assess what we have implemented, and at the end of the day, we troubleshoot where we have issues, and then together we decide how we can go about those issues, whether it is financial investment, whether it is the use of community assets. We realize in here that refugees are not poor as they have been perceived. Refugees are not chaotic people as they are perceived. So there are people who have a need, they have issues, and if we work with them, understand them, we can, as management of education, we can go a long way in providing a quality education. So this is the refugee education participatory model that I come up with. In here, I did not draw the diagram for the other models that I've drawn on to come up with this, but to institutions. So at institutional level, we look at institutional capabilities, and institutions are at the top of everything. These are either government institutions in the country system. At the bottom, we have the community, which is the grassroots recipient. And these communities also have certain assets. Refugees have assets like attitude. Their cultures can be transformed into an asset. For example, when you look at Kiriandongo, all the schools that are there are schools that were initiated or started by refugees. And over time, they just called the government to come in and give certain support. And they hold themselves accountable to the institutions, and the institutions are accountable to the communities that they serve. And at the center of this interaction, we have an adequate education service, or what we regard as the quality education in this case. First, the meetings, which is the forum where all these stakeholders interact to plan, to implement, and evaluate, as well as more approach, which is participatory. So I conclude here by saying that identifying local needs and prevailing positive factors is important in empowering communities and using the power assets of those communities. And if this is done, institutions and the state capacity can come in as a supplement, grow their capabilities, and also obtain the objectives of education. And quality indicators must be shared to include processes, outcomes, and the opportunities or achievement underlying the services provided. And performance standards must be sanctioned in accountabilities and inbuilt performance systems. So I will end at that. And finally, I will say thank you very much, members of the panel and the audience. And thank you very much, my supervisors, Professor Ssimbwa, Solomon, and Professor Mawa, for the fact that you have come up to today. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Yes, Mr. Ssimbwa, I thank you for the work. Mr. Ssimbwa, I thank you for the presentation and the effort you made to complete your study. I thank the supervisors that took you up to where we are. And I wish to thank Professor Mawa, who has endeavored to be with us online despite the weak health he has. We continue to pray to God to consider him, because we still need him for more service so that he gets better. I'll start by asking you, Mr. Ssimbwa, what is your topic? Again, the title of your thesis?
Title is Education Service Management and Quality of Education in the communities.
Are you satisfied with what you've done regarding management?
Yes, I am satisfied with what I have done. I noted that the refugee education management is a complex thing, and management itself is one of the diverse disciplines. So I tried as much as possible to bring the education aspects in the focus, and looking at how it has influences.
What do you take quality education to be? As far as your study is concerned, what do you take a quality education to be?
As I said, the quality of education I'm looking at, I define it as an adequate education that is given to the recipient of that learning. And at the end of the day, the education has met that learner's expectation as well as the expectations of the society. where that education is of quality.
So that makes quality.
That makes quality according to my study.
And you think you're leaving out something? Can we go to your objectives? Objective 2.
Yes. Yeah.
You're concentrating on planning and coordination. Are they the only factors that are important for managers to attain quality education?
Yeah, actually, management transcends planning and coordination. It includes also resource allocation, where we come to budgeting. It includes monitoring. It includes evaluation, but it also goes into the practice itself when we start doing. So by looking at this, the scope noted seriously that we will focus basically on the planning and coordination issues. Although these other elements are important, but the foundation here is how we plan, and then how do we coordinate what we are supposed to be doing for the teachers, for the learners and all other aspects. That's where I focus.
Do you have any way you considered the coordinator skills? Because that is the manager.
When I looked at, I talked about bringing in other actors, for example, the education managers. And I looked at the other players, for example, at local government, the other players at the mandated agencies, the other players in the school. So I bring together those actors at community level, institutional level, which is mandated, and then in the school setting itself, where I look at the learner, and then I try, much as it is complex, but I try to bring it out in the complex form by looking at it as a whole than the deductions approach, where break it into small components. That's why probably it looks out as having this.
Do you agree with me that your statement needs realignment, the statement of your problem?
The statement of the problem.
And this is what led you to that lot of shopping here and there. Because if we are talking about quality of education is something very sensitive, and it is not so cheap. It is not so cheap, so you need to look into that. Then may I know from you how suitable this is in relation to your background, academic background?
Yeah, actually, I am a teacher by training.
Yes.
And I have worked with the refugee communities, sometimes with the children in the schools, and also in my work practices now. I'm working with a community which is a big source of refugees that are staying in Uganda or have stayed in Uganda for a long time. And looking at this, actually, I drew it from the current norm, where we look at the quality from the kind of product that we out at the end. But I try to bring in a new perspective where I look at quality not by focusing at what goes on in the school or what goes on at the end of the graduation, but looking at a new way by looking at the processes that lead to these refugees, and then how we receive these refugees, and the facilities that are available. For example, when you look at the end of this book, where you look at the Kiriandong, you look at the schools which are giving education, and they are set up by the refugee. In the context of self-reliance, does this quality bring the self-reliance we need? Yes, I found out that these people really have a new approach, that they are not refugees who are seeking to give and be given, but they are refugees who have that quality of a parent that we need to see, who identify that this education has to be transformed like this, and none other than us has to do it. Then we call for other stakeholders. And that's why I stated that we are switching the paradigm from looking at quality at the end, but looking at the whole process of things.
If it is the whole process, then you still have some additions to make. Yes. I'm going to invite the internal examiner start with the external. Dr. Badru Musisi, the external examiner, to give his remarks and guidance.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Ssimbwa. I congratulate you for getting this far. Thank you for putting together such an informative I looked at your work thoroughly, and I don't want to ask you so many questions, because if I start, we may not even leave this thing when the sun is up. But your study was about management, education service management, and the quality of refugee communities, and which is clearly indicated in your conceptual framework that you had an independent variable and dependent variable. Fine. But when you look at your topic, you look at your statement of the problem, you look at your purpose, which is the aim, up to the specific objectives, there is no alignment. One element talks about one thing, another element talks about another. For starters, this is what the chair was talking about. When you look at management, education service, management of education service, or education service management, you said you are a teacher by profession. When we are to unpack the concept of education service management in particular, are you familiar with the term management functions? What are the management functions?
You see, when you're doing management functions, we look at planning, directing, coordinating, monitoring, and evaluation. Then the other management theories have brought in coordination, and which actually I hope.
Let's stop there for the time. So, how now we are looking at, we are unpacking management in that respect. I'm glad you are aware of that, because we are talking about, you didn't want to look at management in piecemeals, you wanted to look at it in a wholesome function. Then I'm asking you again, are you familiar with what we call education systems analysis? What are its elements?
See, now when we look at the education systems, one of the things that I looked at is the information, for example. Let us look at education information system that is available.
No, it's not that. Okay, we look at inputs, outcome, and impact.
Right.
That we have the inputs, these teachers, buildings, computers, curriculum. We mix them up in the process, which is the kitchen. We have all these ingredients: teaching, learning, the management you are talking about, quality control, coordination, all is in the process. And that is a black box. Very few people get to know what happens there. We are interested in the output, which is the graduate. But the graduate is not needed for his or her own sake. We need to know what the graduate is capable of. The value added in the process. Then, after the graduate's abilities, then we end up with the impact using the graduate's abilities. What are you are oscillating from management to the systems analysis. But you are not convicting either, because your study will be, but that one is done. Then you jump to the process and you talk about something like process and what happens in the process. You do not unpack that well. So where does your study fall? It does not belong to, does not convict the management aspect, neither does it convict the quality aspect, because from your explanation, you are like, that systems analysis represents quality, and the not so, the indeterminate management represents the management aspect. That is really confusing to the reader, and that partly explains why the lack of alignment between that. And yet for PhD or any other thesis, we need that thin thread right from the topic up to the conclusion that somebody holds on to. And it is, to use your term, it is seriously missing in your study. And then when we get to your statement of, then when we get to the control, quality, the aspect of quality is amorphous, and different people have defined it differently. So in order to bring it out clearly, you have to give us something palpable, tangible, one can hold on to, and it's like, yeah, this is Mr. Ssimbwa's quality. But that too is missing. Then if I bring you to, the purpose was there, but then, which was the study was establishing how, and then your title suggests independent and dependent. Now, when we get to these objectives, because without clear objectives, you cannot have a clear study. But if I'm to comment briefly, you cannot have a 6.5 or 6-page statement of the problem. Your statement of the problem covers 6 or 5 and 3/4 pages. So now that ceases to be a statement of the problem. Most of the stuff you gave as a statement of the problem actually belongs to the contextual background. So you need to fine tune that. Otherwise, as we speak, you don't have a statement of the problem. Now we get to the, just look at your objectives critically. To examine the level and the pattern of access to quality provided, to quality education provided in the refugee communities. The moment you commit yourself now, your variable is now quality education. So what is quality education? Is it access to education or access to quality education? Because you have already qualified that. Now, it's good you work with refugees. Do you consider education in refugee communities as a quality education? Given your definition of quality, just answer the question, yes or no. Do you consider the education in refugee communities, among refugee communities, as a quality education, by your definition of quality? Then, when you say to examine the level and the patterns of access to quality education, it suggests that quality education is given, predetermined. In these refugee communities, they already have quality education. But what is the level and the pattern of access to it?
According to the country system, this is what we expect, and it's the ideal for every child in this learning system. That's why I look at it as the quality education access to quality.
Mr. Ssimbwa,
Then when you go to
my ideal is to become a billionaire. But I'm not. So that doesn't make me billionaire. There is a difference between ideal and actual. So let's stick to reality. And then to examine the planning and coordination. Now, those are some of the management functions. But if your objective is SMART, are you familiar with that acronym? You cannot have planning and coordination in the same specific objective. Have a planning and coordination, they are bigger. You know you are a teacher and a manager. You know what that means. Now, I need to look at your instrument where you were able to capture planning and coordination in one object, in the same objective. That is no longer, we call it a compounded objective. And the compounded objective will give you compounded findings. Then, so, and again, if I'm to go back, okay, planning and coordination factors affecting quality of refugee children education. Okay. To assess the effectiveness of refugee education intervention in building skills for self-reliance. Now I may ask, one of the problems you have, we are talking about refugee education, but I know that these children range from pre-primary, which is ECD, up to university. So did you look at all that?
in the study,
Yes.
yes, in the tools, I had the instruments set to capture all that information and that looking at the different. Looked at how they do it at ECG level. And this is where I looked at in the book I talk about the caregivers.
Okay. How many ECD institutions did you work with?
So in the community, I looked at how they cover the ECD level, and they have a facility for that. And I looked at the facilities they have.
How many schools?
How many schools?
They have over 8 ECD facilities.
How many primary schools?
They have 5 primary schools.
Mm-hmm.
I went to 1 secondary school, which is in there, and 1 secondary school in Kampala. And I looked at other cities, training. That's which are within the community of facilitating passion like university.
Thank you, level of education.
Yes, I broke it down at the effectiveness. I broke it down according to that. How many facilities they have, what is happening in this, and what the respondents are saying according to different levels.
Do we have that up to your conclusion level?
In the conclusions,
Yes.
yes.
Are you sure?
No, let us speak with evidence. Let us say.
I did not put everything.
Let us say. Yeah, quote, yes, and give us a page.
Tell us the page.
So when you look at page 188.
188.
I'm thinking, you want to see what
Write it in the conclusion.
Conclusion.
What's whether yes or no?
Okay. Okay, when you look at page 329. Paragraph 1 talks about much management model as should be implemented in service delivery. But giving limited funding in the schools visited affected the pragmatic management approach where teachers work with community leaders, NGOs, and others. And in some schools, ECD teachers have learned how to work together, overcoming language barriers, and communities contribute to support teachers' transportation and so on.
So, to you, that represents the disaggregated results. Okay, do we have a similar paragraph on vocational, on primary, and on secondary? So as you are looking at that, when you talk about management, is it about education management at school level, or is it about education management at community level?
I actually looked at the actors. I broke it down the actors. Institutional actors, community actors, and then at school level.
Okay, so what was your unit of analysis?
My unit of analysis were refugee students who were in school at the high.
Mr. Ssimbwa, there is what we call unit of analysis and unit of observation. I guess you observed the students. You said you observed and gave them questionnaires and the focus group discussion. But when you are analyzing, like drawing conclusions, are you drawing conclusions based on the individual students' questions, or are you drawing conclusions? Because as a policymaker, I would wish to know that, so that I can make targeted policies. So the unit of analysis here is key. So was it the student, the institution, or those units you are talking about? You call them actors. How are those actors you are talking about? What was your unit?
My unit of analysis was the student, because this is the target that we want to see whether we have achieved our objective or not. And in looking at these students as what happens to them, they are the ones who observe it, they feel even the problem, they experience everything along with the teachers. But when we go to the collaborated approach, I realized that you cannot look at the processes and inputs. It is not only the learner who comes from the home, comes from the school, that you have to analyze. I looked at other things which are responsibility of the mandatory agency or the education implementers or the government. But in drawing conclusion, because these policies are supposed to target the children and what they get from the school. So that's why I look at the refugee student as the element that has to be analyzed, and what their experiences and what they have to say.
Okay, I get it. Thank you very much, Mr. Ssimbwa. Now, this is some advice, serious advice. You have a lot of experience with refugee communities. And that experience is contaminating your study. You know a lot. and you are offloading all that refugee stuff in the book. But a PhD has principles. We have protocols that we have that you start from the first page up to the last page. And those the protocols today we call them what? Standard operating SOPs. The PhD SOPs are clear. And you cannot fight them. You have to bend. So get all that vast information you know about the PhD standard. Your oral is convincing. When you start talking about refugees, everybody's like, wow, but remain on the shelf. So try to ensure that you put all that in the PhD framework.
Thank you. Thank you. We shall hear from the internal examiner.
Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you, my colleague, Dr. Bud. Peter, I did part of PhD today. But now you have known. Did you know they existed? What's your title? Read for me. Title page. He has talked about the oral narration. I'm going to go more technical. What is here?
Education service management and point of education.
Okay, leave that one. I'll just go down. This is submitted. This is submitted.
This is submitted to the Directorate of Graduate Studies and Research.
Continue.
The fulfillment of requirements, the award of the degree of informal studies.
Development studies. Thank you very much. I'll ask another question later on with the concern. You swallowed some words there when you write in the title. Requirements of and so on and so on. For the award, not of the award. For. Anyway, Chair, our candidate needs a lot of proofreading and editing. And I'm happy my colleague Dr. Butler has mentioned that big voice, oh yes, but what remains on scriptures a lot is there. So look at the way you've indented, it's erratic, you're indenting, and even you're referencing. I'm going to give first of all the general comment and I go to details. There are some incorrect citations. They're not following. I don't know whether you're following APA 4, 5, 6, or 7. I think you're supposed to be still on 6, I think. We're going to go to 7 yet, but we're about to go there. But you're still on 6 for you. 6. And there are some words that you made proper nouns unnecessarily by capitalization. Get them there. The number of sweeping statements that you made. And your chapter alignment, or even since every chapter begins with an introduction, it's also probable for it to have a conclusion. Don't you think so? And then citations, serious anomaly. There are very many texts cited that are not reflected in the references. Many. I have listed them for you, you'll see in the book. And there are also many that are in the references that are not in text. So I wonder what happened. You'll see it there. If you want to argue, you can take it. You want us to go through that?
No, I know that, and I know how it came about.
Okay, fine.
Share with the committee. I'm sorry, I had a problem with my computer.
We are marking this
Don't
one.
blame the computer.
Yeah,
Because
marking
the
this one.
editing issues.
No.
I also observed when I code this algorithm and read through.
Teacher, have you ever heard the statement that a poor workman blames the tools? Hey, it is you that we're looking at. If you're an officer and your secretary makes a mistake and it goes out, it is you, not the secretary, not the typist, not your computer. Accept that. Oh, and don't run away from that. Thank you. Abstract. Let's go to abstract. Abstract is what sells you. It's what sells your work. Maybe before I go to abstract, your text there. What date is it? The date at the bottom?
The date is May 2018.
2018. 2019. I just want to make sure that we're on the same book, same level. But I'm going to ask my other questions. They'll be relevant. 2019. So look at your abstract. It's not conventional. There are so many things missing in it. You need to make it so that it sells you. What did you set out to do? How did you do it? What were the major what method did you use? Because PhD. What were the findings? You know, what were your conclusions? They should all come out clean in the abstract. Maximum 2 pages, 1 page is best. Please. And that's the part you should work on serious. What sells you? People don't bother reading the rest of the book if they see the abstract not talking. And that should sell you. You need to write it properly, adequately. When you go to, when I went abstract earlier, but operational terms, alphabetize them. Don't just put them changanyiko mahalo.
And sorry, the standard abstract is on
One page. One page. Remember
I
that.
don't know how many pages.
It's true. This is what I'm telling our colleagues. It is 1 page. Eventually, if you pardon?
Without paragraphs.
With exact 1 paragraph. Thank you very much, members. Because you may think I hate my namesake. Peter, are you there? You are available. I like that. I want you to read for us page 1. It's something which I didn't understand. Maybe it will help me. The last sentence of page 1. Members, forgive me for this paper, but I went into detail and will help him. I'll try to be fast. This kind of introduction. Read for us. Yes.
The last paragraph.
Yes, please. Last sentence of the first paragraph.
Last sentence.
Yes.
It starts with address.
Upon this study, introduction to the study.
Introduction to the study.
The last sentence there,
Yeah.
beginning with upon this study.
Introduction. Upon this study, introduction, content, conceptualization. Upon this study.
That's what we are listening. Continue.
Even spelled
Yeah, that's what we are listening.
Upon this study, introduction to the conceptualization.
And very many sentences are like that. Ssimbwa. And a teacher, we cannot forgive such grammatical error and mistakes. Even when you go to this page, you find out of that detail in my work, in the book I looked at. Another thing, members, when you're handing book for marking such a book, take care to look at it. I was a bit insulted because some of the pages were upside down. They were abusing me. I didn't know whether I was reading Arabic or check through before you hand in, because when you hand in, you don't again blame whoever bound it. Say now the photocopier there who bound it. It is your mistake. None of them are here. Upside down. What some pages are. So you don't. Can I show you mine? Let me. Is your page 14 and 15? Are they okay in yours? Page 14.
Yeah, page 14 is okay. I have a table there.
And
And
you can see mine. I don't know how to read it.
upside down.
Yes, please. Yeah, here, you can see it.
So that's why you are surprised.
That's why you're surprised. Maybe I'm having a wrong book. Don't give you a snake. Can we have some more fun? Page 35. This is supposed to be your work. We know you know about, but I want you to distill it properly. Page 31, are you there? And 35, 35. Yes, the investment made by partners. That one there, on top. The investment
made by partners of Asia,
louder, please.
and nations, and the being and as several.
Thank you very much. Are you in a better? Stop there. Are you in a better? In court? Investment made by partners of the UNHCR and the nations as severally been and as the High Commission. What are you talking about? I have another question for you. Chair, you bear with me a bit. There was a bit of an anomaly. You didn't apologize at the beginning. That's why I asked you about that book and the date and your presentation. A lot of mismatch. For example, in the conceptual framework, it's good you made a good one. I commented on this one. I said decongest the CP because it was too congested and muffled up and muddled. But now my question is, what informed you to change from what was here to what is there? That's the first. The first one, what? First, wait, what? Then when did you do it and why?
First, I would apologize for the different versions. I realized somebody was printing my work. I was not here. I was sending it to somebody to print and submit for me. So I did not have a chance to read what they have submitted and what they are, which version, which copy they are submitting. And this is where the error.
No wonder I got mine as the upside down.
Yeah, but later on, I corrected some of these copies. So during the submission time, I think that's where the problem was. Somebody had to submit a different version. And
don't blame our directorate.
No, it's not the directorate. It's from my side. I'm a student, but you know, this happened during the COVID time. We were locked somewhere. And I was sending somebody to please, can you do this for me during the COVID time? But I observed this actually.
It follows my next point. Yeah, I'm not going to give you time to respond, but you know too much about these things and how to defend yourself. In a scholarship.
And before, let me remind you, Mr. Ssimbwa, you are defending the PhD thesis, not yourself.
Exactly.
The two of you are different. So in your defense, focus on the thesis. It's not on Mr. Ssimbwa. Thank you.
It follows. It's now in scholarship, Ssimbwa, and I get it out of my writing desk and it's published. When I want to refer to it, I must quote myself. If I don't, I'm accused of self-plagiarism. The presentation had that. So avoid that in future. It doesn't go out yet. But avoid revising on work with impunity. The rules, these are SOPs, by the way. And self-plagiarism is also as bad as the other one. The deed is on my neck that I should stop talking. Yes, okay. Now, last but not least, PowerPoint. Can you go back to your first PowerPoint, sir? That's my last one. Chairman, this is my last one. PowerPoint there. Yeah, PowerPoint is not PowerPoint, but Power Notes. Please avoid Power Notes. Our SOP say PowerPoint presentation, not Power Notes. I beg to submit.
Thank you, Doctor. Please polish up the work so that when it appears on the shelves, you look at Dr. Ssimbwa notes.
Exactly.
Mr. Ssimbwa. That's
The defensive one.
very hard.
Thank you.
You are 5 minutes.
Good. I will not go over what has been said already. Thank you, Ssimbwa, for your piece of work. And thank you for the vigor in presenting it. One, your scope of the study, your time scope, I found no scope. Educate us on what your scope of the study was, statement of the problem. My next one, I'm wondering, how is your conceptual framework related to your objectives of the study? Hope you are noting how your conceptual framework relates to the objectives of the study. My third one, I'm wondering, in your chapter 3, at PhD level, you ought to indicate the research philosophy as hinged on the ontology, epistemology, and axiology. I'm wondering, where are these in your chapter 3? I didn't see them, because that is the basis that in the field. I didn't see that. And I'm wondering, what was your research paradigm? Still, I didn't see that. On your page 106 or 106, where is the total and the target population? Where are these refugees, refugee learners? What was the total population or the parent population and the target population? You based on to get the 100. Wondering, where are the findings of the chi-square? And what does it mean? And what does it mean to use a chi-square? What does it mean to use this kind of study? Where are the results of these two? I did not find this anyway. In your chapter 4, I did not find the historical trend of educational service management. Because I'm wondering, where are the major philosophers like Socrates, Plato? Who is the ideal educationist? Actually, when we talk of education, Plato is the ideal education. He's talking about ideal education. So ideally, all these things you are talking, where are they stemming from? You only went ahead, before you go ahead, you did not bring out Aristotle. You brought out John Rawls. John Rawls talks about educational justice. How is this related? That didn't come out. I expected to find philosophers like Karl Popper, because Karl Popper is a contemporary philosopher in in education. And he talks about the 3 worlds of knowledge, which could have enriched your study at a PhD level. I didn't see that. Still in your chapter 4, I did not find who was the major philosopher of your study that informed this study. So who could have been the major philosopher of this study? So you bring Martin Buber, you bring Jasper, you're bringing, that doesn't fit in here. Still here, what are the legal aspects? What are the legal aspects on education management in the Ugandan setting to bring out the cutting edge of knowledge? That has not come out. So if the cutting edge of knowledge is not appearing, then how did you come up with the model that you brought? I'm contesting your qualitative findings. That was raw data. Because it was unanalyzed, you only brought the verbatim. At PhD level, what did you use the in vivo for? So which analyzed data came from the in vivo? Okay? Since you had an issue with the data analysis techniques, the qualitative findings are not there. That's not how we transcribe qualitative findings. The quantitative I already commented. As I conclude, you had a very nice model. My wonder is, you talked about other refugee models. What did you go to look for from other refugee models? Yet you could concentrate on education management and education quality models and how they would fit in the refugee education. I didn't see the reason for that. What was the evolution of your model? So, Ssimbwa, I want to ask you a personal question. Am I right to say that this model is forced in your study? Because all of a sudden it appears from nowhere. It's foreign. I didn't see the basis of the model. Where is the model coming from? I didn't see the testability of the model. In other words, what new thing is your study bringing? Conclude. How is your unit of analysis? I'm restating what was raised here. How is your unit of analysis related to your conclusion? And where are the implication of the findings in the conclusion on the unit of analysis? That does not come out. I didn't see recommendations. So where is the recommendation related to your significance of the study? That one does not feature. Chair, I beg to submit for now.
I thank you, Dr. Chimunji. And now, Mr. Ssimbwa, do you wish to respond?
Thank you very much.
In 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Change.
Some you can take it as comments,
But majorly, you may respond about the correspondence of the model and your unit of analysis, then to explain how you go to that model. Because the journal is not seen anywhere in the world.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shinji. Thank you very much, Dr. Tiyo. On the errors and the typos, I will fix that. I already started, as I read through some of them I had already observed. And I will modify this so that we have the finest document at the end. On the scope of the study, I actually gave in the presentation, I did not put it, but when you read the document, at least that part of the scope is thoroughly covered, and it gives the clear page 27, such that you find the book. I'm talking about time scope. I say in the time 27, what is the time scope? I say in the time scope that and how does this relate to the statement? Much of the analysis were limited to the period of implementation of universal primary education between 1997 and 2018. But this one, I will improve to add up to 2020 because the study has transcended that period. And I added this in here.
Time scope should be guided by when was the problem that was started. Because back to understand what you told me, no problem was not there. The literature reviewed the index. It goes back to the time what you told me. You're having unsigned literature. So that's what I'm ready to say you don't have the time scope. Because indeed, I didn't see it.
Okay, I will modify the time scope and put it in line with the beginning of the problem. But in looking at this, we trace the inconsistencies that are talked about in this study from when we started universal primary education with meager resources and unclear funding sources. And this is what continues to affect universal education as well as refugee education currently. But I will try to put it in the context as it's supposed to be.
And when you are trying,
Yeah.
your scope actually sounds like a methodology, literature, you know, just stick to the scopes and what you have to look at in the scope.
I think Mr. Ssimbwa, you still have to go back to the SOPs of the PhD study. Realign your work according to the requirements. Yes. The rest you can use that or that other information in other writings. Yes.
Then on the model, you ask why do I have to go back to all these models?
Where is that model coming from? How does it come?
The model which I have here, I said in here that I looked at quality as has been traced from UNESCO and other agencies dealing with education, looking at which model they are using when they are implementing these education interventions. And drawing from that, I look at what really happens now and what is Uganda system doing. Then look at what is in the framework now for comprehensive in Uganda. Then, basing on that, I looked at what they have and what is limited in its scope or in the framework. And then, yes.
In your chapter 4,
Yes.
did you find any major program?
Yes. For example, when you look at it, yes.
I want you to explain how it is there for you to come up with the model. Is a government something? That's one, two. Did you find any gap in the findings? Because now you're talking about other models. We want, what does your study talk about to your model?
Use 1 minute to answer that, and then we can move to the next.
When we look at the findings, you find that there is an approach that is used. I talked about the age gender diversity meetings approach, which is being used in the implementation of any education area study. And when we look at the models which exist, they don't integrate that. That's why I had to look at how do we get this into play and come up with a model that covers which comprehensively is supposed to be brought into this, into the framework that is suggested now.
As you study have the data component.
As per the objectives, not. But when you look at the
Mr. Ssimbwa, take note of whatever is being hinted on and try to include it in your corrections as you finalize.
And your
But
model
don't add anything you cannot complete this.
comprehensive.
Let's have but Mr. Ssimbwa, missing in your work, you need to take note that you have to add them there before it is received.
Thank you, Mr. Ssimbwa, for that presentation. But the reason why all of these issues are being raised is because you misconceptualize your variables, and because you misconceptualize your variables, you fail to come up with an ideal problem. What is the study problem actually? Before we dig anywhere, what is the study problem? Second, the reason why your findings do not count is because you state your objectives in a quantitative manner, them in a qualitative way. For example, objective 3 and objective 4. You can't say to assess the effectiveness. You can't say to assess management practices qualitatively. You'd have come up with hypotheses. But you insisted on the research questions, of which the research questions are out of context. And that's the reason why your findings are out of context. What you have to do is to differentiate the data you have analyzed is, you have analyzed the data based on your conviction of the problem than the data collected. And if I'd wanted to do this study, I would trace, as you are talking about the tracer tools, I would trace the students who have gone through this education system up to the end, where they are working, and I see the impact, the quality you are talking about, but not to assess the pre-students, pre-children in ECD, you are talking about quality. How are you going to measure quality in that situation? You may not see the impact. And that is the challenge you have now. So when you look at many of the things that have been said about the target population, the sample population, and the like, what were your specific respondents? It can't be that you could assess all levels. That's why the analysis went into oblivion. You lost it. You can't assess ECD, you can't assess primary, you can't assess secondary, you can't assess, and then you have to say even the graduates. Is there a university there? Well, how did you find the graduates? Now, when you go to page 89, check on page 89. Page 89, you talk about the conceptual framework. Moderators and mediators. Because they are used in a different context, but we use them, and it's just, even you can just click on the, you can just click there. Look at the conceptual framework.
It's up there.
Yeah. You use the moderating variables, which are supposed to alter the impact the independent variable has on the dependent variable. But for you, even the arrows are actually totally different. And then the mediating variables. What is the context there? I don't understand it. Then when you look at validity and liability of your, you don't have actually validity and liability. Just add, there are no statistics, there are no conclusions. You just talk about it. And you find that the conclusions do not match with the objectives. The recommendations are out of context. So you need to follow step by step up to the conclusion. But the moment you don't do that, then you are going to have a lot of gaps, and I can assure you this study has a lot of gaps to address. Thank you.
Topic that Mr. Ssimbwa, you have listened. And the last statement was that there are a number of gaps depending on the various panelists. And it means that you have work to do to put this work at a reasonable and acceptable level. You've noted that right from the topic, the challenges. When you move to the statement of the problem, it needs realignment. And the moment you lose out with the statement of the problem, everything will go astray because even the objectives will not be properly guided. When you proceed to the conceptual framework, as it has been stated, you notice that there is a mismatch. And when you go to the entire work you did in the field, the parent population, the targets, they are all misguided. So it means that you have work to do right from the beginning up to the end. And it means a lot. It means a lot. I shall send in the remarks to you in detail on top of what